So, as I mentioned in the last satsang, and just for those listening, in case you haven't, satsangs are on twice a week, on Wednesdays and on Saturdays. So, as I mentioned in the last satsang, today I wanted to focus on, or at least in part, talk about this point about who cares about so many things in life, about what happened in the past, about what happened in the future, about what someone is doing, how life is unfolding. And the question is, who is it that cares? And this who question mark, or what cares? And so at first it's like, who cares? Because it's usually I care. If we ask the question when someone is so upset about, let's say, what someone else thinks or someone else's opinion, and we say, who is it that cares about what the other person thinks? And it's like, well, I care about what the other person thinks. And then we say, so who is this I? Or what is, once we start looking into it, we might shift from the who to the what. So it starts off on the surface, it feels like a who, and automatically we would say I. And then we say, let's look into what this I is. And we will see that what we call the I, and what seems to be very concerned about what the other might be saying or thinking, is actually a thought movement. And when we look at that thought movement, we need to ask where it comes from. And if we don't investigate into this, we will just take it on face value. And on face value, it feels like it is a me, or it is a real thing that is concerned, an entity. The person is what we would say. It feels like, the person is concerned about what the other person thinks. And then when we look into it more closely, we see it's a thought narrative, that, or a psychological identity that is concerned with what the other thinks. And then when we look at what this psychological identity is, we find it's essentially a thought arising. And when we look at where this thought comes from, we see it, well, they either, from one perspective, we say they just appear out of nowhere. And from another perspective, we can say they are the result of the brain, or the thinking. Let's see if this holds. The thinking machine, the brain, which is described in the teaching as a biological instrument designed by, well, let's just call it life, definitely not designed by the entity that contains the brain, designed by life and shaped by life to function a certain way, and thoughts are an output of that brain. And when the brain is shaped a certain way, it produces this sense of a me, and that sense of the me can take life very personally. And so then an outcome happens, or an event happens, someone says something to someone else behind your back, and that identity gets very concerned and takes it as very important. This shouldn't have happened. They shouldn't be talking about me in that way. And so when we look at it, on the surface, it feels like I am concerned. And when we look more closely, we find it's a thought that arises because the circumstance, which is, let's say, finding out that this person has said X, Y, and Z about you, triggers the movement of the brain to produce these thoughts. And if that dynamic is something that the body-mind organism becomes aware of, we might then say, so who is it that is concerned about what the other person thinks? And we might realize it's a machine that is producing an output of thinking that is taking the situation very personally. And so the more closely we look at this, we find there is no who. If anything, there's a what, and the what is this narrative. And where does this narrative come from? It comes from the biological instrument, the biological robot that is designed to produce that output. And if the biological instrument, the biological robot, is redesigned, reprogrammed, what we can find is that the narrative it produces is different. That the narrative can change from taking something personally to taking it not so personally. What that means is a biological instrument changes where what the other person thinks at first is deemed to be very important about who I am. And what I mean by who I am when we start looking at it is very important within the narrative that is creative. So the narrative that is creative is a narrative that either takes what the other person says as very important to my survival or my existence, or a narrative that doesn't seem to take it very important arises. And those two outputs of the biological instrument are radically different in their content and in how that content influences and makes the experience feel. So much so that if the biological instrument changes in such a way that it doesn't produce thoughts that take the circumstance very personally, we will say that the psychological identity has dissolved. That's what it will feel like. Like the psychological identity has dissolved. Now, what has really dissolved is a certain type of thinking. And so when we look at this closely, if we start to see this, we'll see that what I know myself as is content of thought. And when that content stops happening, we could say, I dissolve. Now, it's not so much that I dissolve, it's the I that I was so familiar with because it kept arising. At some point, may not arise anymore. And it's only when we really appreciate it as a certain type of thought that arises that we realize that there never was someone there that took the situation personally, but rather there was a certain thought that arises that contains within it the sense of me, the idea of a me that situation is attacking. And when that thought dissolves, the problem dissolves with it. And so if the biological instrument understands that someone else's opinion, for example, is exactly that, and that if there isn't an involvement in that opinion, then they're entitled to the opinion and it has no effect on my experience. If, however, the body-mind organism believes that what someone else says about you behind your back, for example, is very important and should or shouldn't be a certain way because it affects my completeness or my existence, then if that's the programming, then there will be an involvement in what someone has said. And that involvement is horizontal in time, what we can call the thinking mind. And that appears in experience. It feels like it is me, it is I. So when we ask the biological instrument that is functioning that way, who is so concerned about what that person said about you? Who is so concerned? The automatic response from that biological instrument, if the biological instrument hasn't been directed to look at this closely, will say, well, what do you mean? I am concerned. I care about what they are saying. And then we say, who is this I? And on the surface, it's like, what do you mean, who is this I? Or what is this I? Roger, Jane, whatever the person's name is, that's who cares. The point is to look deeply at what is the human being, what is the biological instrument, and we'll find that there is exactly that, a biological instrument that is a result of one's genes and up-to-date conditioning, which really means a biological structure, a biological entity grows, the sperm and the egg come together, and a certain blueprint gets put in place, and then the biological entity grows according to that blueprint. And included in that biological entity growing, the heart develops, and along with all of the other biological systems, the brain develops, and at a certain point, they start functioning. And our whole life has been the experience of a biological instrument interacting with life. And the output is the sense of a me, a sense of a doer, an individual that is in control of everything that happens. That's the sense. When we look more closely, we find that we are an output rather than the one making everything happen. We are a result. And that may seem like someone might say, what's the point of all of this? And the point is that if we come to understand what we are more accurately, then the sense of self changes. So the sense of self basically means, how do I know myself? And if I know myself as something that is heavily affected in according to the biological instrument, when I say I'm talking about the biological instrument's programming about where its completeness comes from. So for example, if that instrument thinks its completeness comes by everyone delivering pleasure to me, everyone saying nice things about me, if that's its belief, then whenever someone doesn't say nice things, that is an attack on that psychological identity, that idea of oneself. And that's just how life has designed us, how life has impacted the human being, or created the human being. So if that human being then changes because life brings about new information, which is new up-to-date or new conditioning that changes our up-to-date conditioning, then the structure changes. And if the structure changes such that we realize, oh, my completeness isn't dependent on the other saying nice things about me. The other saying nice things or not nice things is either pleasure or pain. And if it's become clear to this biological instrument that pleasure or pain are the natural flow of life, sometimes pleasure, sometimes pain, not something we can control. We can't control what everyone is thinking and saying about us. We can't control the weather or what animals do or laws of physics. You know, if a tree branch is too heavy for the support that is included in the tree branch, it's going to fall to the ground. And if we're underneath it, it's going to fall on our head. So there are many factors in life that we can't control. Sometimes life is going to be pleasurable, sometimes painful. That's emotional pleasure or pain, physical pleasure or pain, financial pleasure or pain. And the human identity has developed such that we are identified with, we are attached to, which really means we associate life working with life being pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And so that identification, which comes from the sense of self that has developed, means that whenever life is painful, and often when it's pleasurable, there's going to be a sense of resisting life, because it's seen to be an attack on who I am. So coming to see that I am a biological instrument that is functioning exactly according to its design and can't function any other way, and that there really is no me as imagined before things are seen clearly. As we see this, it makes a big impact on the sense of self. It changes the sense of self, because the sense of self that feels very impacted by circumstance, that sense of self sees it as the orchestrator of life, sees itself as the doer, sees itself as the one that exists, as a separate, independent entity that is not mechanical in nature. And so as it starts to become more and more apparent that what I've always known myself as is the output of a mechanical movement that can't be any other way, then that changes the the idea of the sense of self that most humans have. And if that structure changes, then the feeling we have about ourselves changes. And obviously, if we have the wrong idea of what we are, meaning if we believe ourselves to be an autonomous entity in complete control, when we're not that, then that's a false sense of self. It's a false idea. So I used an example recently, not in satsang, but it came about when I was talking to someone. And it really demonstrates what non-doership means in a powerful way. Because I describe non-doership as being the recognition that there is no separate me controller making certain actions happen, but rather the actions, the speaking, the thinking, the emotions, the behaviors, how you interact or respond in a situation, are all a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, right? And so a recognition of that means, in each moment, every human being is functioning exactly the way they're designed to function. Now that could be very clear, but it could also be heard. The words could be heard, and the implication or what is being said isn't processed in a sort of deep enough or absolute enough way. And so it's heard, but it doesn't really have the impact on some people at certain times of making them realize, wow, who is doing this? There isn't a who, there is a biological instrument, a machine functioning. And that relating to ourselves as a biological instrument isn't going to change the wonder of life. It isn't going to change the feelings that humans have, feelings of love, feelings of joy and gratitude and awe. All it does is it explains those feelings as being a result of this very complex instrument. So it doesn't reduce life down to something much less. Life continues to be as full as it always was, but now there is an attitude to these feelings and these reactions that is different to what was there before. Before, the attitude was, I, as some doer that can choose how I feel and how I respond, am living life. And the new attitude is, I have always been being lived by life, which really means life has designed an instrument that is going to function exactly the way it functions in each moment. And the two attitudes are radically different. The second attitude allows things to unfold as they unfold, and then the attitude said, yes, that's destiny unfolding. The initial sense of self can't accept what the other does because it says you should have done it differently, especially if it delivers pain to us. And if our actions deliver pain to ourselves, then we say, no, I should have done it differently. So why this isn't clear is because a lot of the functioning of this biological instrument seems like I am doing it. And it's only when we start to have experiences of our own, when things change, that then demonstrate that something that I thought was my doing wasn't ever something I was as in control as I thought. So the experience that I started to have was some years back. I had something went wrong in my system. An illness of some sort. And there were some neurological effects as a result of a virus, probably. And certain things started to function differently. For a short period of time, there was no short-term memory. Now, I'm not talking about short-term memory as in what I did yesterday. I'm talking about short-term memory about what happened a millisecond before. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean what it sounds like. What it revealed to me, so I'll tell you how it manifested. What it revealed to me is certain functions that are happening that we don't realize are functions. We just assume that they are something that I do. Like, I remember what happened a second ago or a millisecond ago. It's only when we start to find ourselves in a function doing something that requires a memory and we don't have it. And then we realize, I was able to function normally because memory was working seamlessly. Memory of what happened a second ago or a millisecond ago. So the situation that happened is when I was driving, if I needed to turn onto a main road from a side street, you'd sit there in the side street and you'd look left and right, or right and left, depending on which side of the road, which country you're in, what side of the road you're on. So in Australia, you drive on the left-hand side of the road. And so if you're turning right, you have to cross a lane of traffic to get into onto the side of the road that you want to travel on. And so you'd look one way and then look the other, and then look back that way for one last thing, and then drive out. So I'd do that, look that way, then look that way, then look that way, and forget, like not know whether it was clear on the left. So just, I had looked there a second ago, and now I'm looking there, and I can't really remember whether it was safe to go. Whereas previously, you would look one way, the other way, register, clear, one more look that way, and then go. And I found myself moving my head back and forth because I couldn't remember what I've just checked. And so that started to show me that there's a functioning there that, well, it didn't really start to show me this. It's obvious. It was obvious to me in principle that we are a biological instrument. This particular incident highlighted this in practice in a very obvious way. And so then I had to retrain myself as to, without memory, to know that if I have looked the third time, or the third way, then it was safe on that way. So I would reprogram myself as to how to drive. This memory thing came back, and so that wasn't needed anymore. But it just shows that the brain works or it doesn't work. And what we think is my doing, i.e. remembering what was checked over there, is not something that I control, but rather just a functioning of the machine. And there was also a sense that would happen sometimes where stimuli would come in, and the stimuli would overwhelm the system where they previously wouldn't. The neurology didn't seem to be able to handle too much stimuli coming in at once. And there were times when, if I had been doing certain things or engaging in a certain way, that I would notice and get glimpses of how I could be driving and may in fact just pull in front of oncoming traffic because the brain wouldn't register that the car is coming, so you can't go. And on the little times when I sort of just got a glimpse that the brain wasn't really absorbing a situation, which in its mild form would just be what we call absent-mindedness. When it presents in a specific way and you think, wow, my brain is processing normally, when it's working normally, my brain is processing the situation, and it knows that when it sees a car, that you can't go. And so most of the time, we sit there and we wait till the road is clear, and then we go. And so when that's happening, it feels like I am the one assessing the situation, the me, the controller, the doer, the one that makes life happen. I'm assessing the situation, and once I've assessed it to be safe, I go. When you start finding the body functioning in a way that doesn't make sense, like going when oncoming traffic is coming, that's when you realize, hey, who's making the car drive? And you say, well, the body's making the car drive, and the body I thought I was in control of, but rather what I thought was my doing was the functioning of a machine. And when the machine malfunctions, that's when you realize it was always the functioning of the machine, never my doing as a doer, but always the functioning of a machine that was functioning properly. And therefore, the things that were happening were very explainable. And so we'd say, yes, I did it that way. Whereas in fact, it was the machine doing it that way. So as we start getting older, we might stop being able to calculate things, let's say. Stop being able to remember things. We might not be able to do certain tasks that we could do before. If we have brain damage, this might happen. We might not be able to do something that we did before. And it depends what our understanding of that is. If it happens in a certain way, and you try to speak and the words come out all jumbled, that's when you realize that I was never the one speaking, but rather the machine was producing the speech in the right way. And because it came out the right way, the way that I want it to come out, then we say, oh, I did it. When it starts coming out not the way we want it, then we start saying, I'm not in control, because if I was in control, I'd get the words to come out the way that I wanted. And so this can be a bit like, we use the analogy of tossing a coin. If you toss a coin 10 times and you call heads and it comes up heads 5 times, we might say, if we don't understand the dynamics, we might say, oh, those 5 times it came up because I was in control. Now, when we understand the dynamics of tossing a coin, so we don't make the mistake of saying, when I called heads and it came up heads, that was when I was in control. And then when I called heads and it didn't come up heads, it came up tails, that's when I was not in control. If we look at that, we realize in none of the cases were you in control, but sometimes the mechanics that you weren't in control of delivered the outcome that you wanted. And in life, the mechanics of the body are often delivering outcomes that we want, and yet we make the mistake of claiming ownership over the mechanics that do this. And so a deep recognition of this will freak some people out, because it'll be like, who am I then? And an existential fear will kick in, a fear that, no, I don't want to acknowledge this, because if I acknowledge this, this means I'm not in control of getting the outcomes that I believe will one day give me happiness. And so a denial comes in. So there would be a group of people, if I put this talk out to the general public, there would be a whole lot of reactions of people without them even realizing it, just arguing with what is being said, saying, no, that's not right, without realizing why the argument is happening. The argument would be coming probably not from actually listening objectively in an unattached way, but rather feeling somehow attacked by this explanation and impulsively resisting it. So many arguments and discussions or debates happen not because both sides are really looking at the dynamics clearly and arguing based on how they see the clear dynamics. Because if that's the case, there wouldn't be that many arguments. Because the dynamics are one way, and if we look at them clearly, we'd agree, yes, that's the way they are, and we'd be in agreement. The reason most people have debates and arguments is because they're coming at a situation from a psychological point of view, i.e. attached to a particular outcome, not looking at the situation objectively, where they let go of the outcome they're attached to and look at the situation and say, look, forgetting my preference of what happens, the system is like this, And it makes sense, for example, that I don't get what I want because there's more people that will benefit from something different. We don't want to acknowledge that, so we somehow skew an argument that really isn't an argument that should win, and we try to make it make sense, try to make it such that our preference, and so this is what happens in politics. Some people are going to benefit from a Republican government because the Republican government will give things that a certain person wants and will benefit from, and another person will benefit from, let's say, Democrat policies. And so those two people are going to argue with each other as to which government is best, without realizing that the reason they're arguing is because they get different things from each government, and one person gets more from that government, the other gets more from that government. Of course, your preference is, I want that government, you want that, and they should hug and say, I completely understand why you want that government, and I understand why I want this government. I love you anyway. Good luck to you. Good luck to me. Let's see what the majority of the people want. And whichever the majority of the people want will be elected. And either I'm going to get what I want or you're going to get what you want. If that situation is seen clearly, then no need to try and convince the other person to agree with the party that you agree with, because you look at it and say, they're not going to benefit from the party I want coming in. So how is it that I should expect to convince them to like the party I like? But, we don't tend to be that clear on these things, so we end up getting attached to various things. Anyway, don't know where that came from. Or where it fits in. I'm sure maybe you don't know either. So to round it all off, essentially, what I hope we can start to see is that these functionings that we assume are me as a separate independent doer, which really means we have an idea of myself as the one in control of what the body does. And it's complete opposite. We're the one we are a result of the body rather than the cause of what the body does. We are the output. What do I mean by the output? I'm talking about the sense of self, the personality, the preferences in the moment, the movements in the moment, all of that which is part of the experience of Roger, are produced by life, not by Roger the controller, or Roger the one that might say, I am Roger, which is fine, depends on what attitude or what image you have of this I. So Roger uses the word I a lot, but he doesn't use the word I referring to a separate, independent entity in control, but rather he refers to I as being the culmination of life up to this point through this particular body-mind organism. A body-mind organism designed by life, programmed by life, which is part of its design, functioning according to the situation it finds itself in, functioning automatically. And every human being that exists today, in this moment, is functioning exactly the same way. The only way they can, in accordance to their genes and up-to-date conditioning. Now, I'm not saying that everyone is functioning in a beautiful, loving way. Not at all. I'm just saying everyone is functioning the way that they are designed to function. So this is not saying, and that's, that can sometimes be unpalatable to someone because they don't want everyone to function exactly the way they're designed to function. What they want is everyone to deliver pleasure, pleasure, pleasure to me. And so there's a resistance to acknowledging that everyone in each moment is designed by life, functioning according to life's design in that moment, which another way we can say it is they're functioning according to the predetermined story of life. Destiny unfolding, God's will, including my actions in this moment, my thoughts, my feelings. If there's suffering there, that's the machine producing suffering. If there's joy there, that's the machine producing joy. If there's an attitude of resentment to someone for what they have done, that's the machine producing that. And the benefit in this is like a relaxation, what a relief. I don't have to feel like I have to control life all the time. I can watch it unfold as a happening. So this who could have done things differently. You know, you're talking about the person who is talking behind your back. And I say, who is talking behind your back? Who? And you might say, John is talking behind my back. I say, who is John? Who is this John that you are so convinced should be doing things differently? What do you mean, who? John? John is the man up the road. And who is the man up? What is the man up the road? The man up the road is an instrument through which life is happening. An instrument that is an expression of life. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. In some of the Indian scriptures, it talks about the 5 elements, that the human being is a result of the 5 elements. It's a way of really talking about a biological instrument. But instead of talking about a mechanical robot, which is made of plastic and metal and screws, and a biological instrument is made out of fire, air, water, wood, and stone. And those are all of those things in their different mixes and compositions make up all of the elements. So those natural elements make up the more specific elements of the periodic table, the chemical elements. All of those stem from the basic ingredients of life. And then those chemical elements come together in more complex forms in the human body. And so essentially, the human being as it's being described, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, it basically means we are a result of basic elements of life with a biological robot, biological instrument. This attitude, as we start, there's a great opportunity to just witness life from this place, which is a much less involved. So we're talking about who is John up the road that you are so sure should do things different, and who is it that cares about what John does? And when we look at it, we'll see it's the psychological me that believes it is the doer, John is the doer, and that its happiness is to be found in pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And as that starts to crumble, we find that there's a self-contentment. There's a peace that isn't because of causes. It's a causeless happiness, a causeless peace, and that a causeless meaning even to life. And so as we go to our own experiences, it changes. We realize that, what creates a lack of meaning, a lack of comfortableness with life is this psychological identity that at its nature is an uncomfortableness with oneself, an uncomfortableness with the other because of what they're doing and what we're doing. And that false idea of the doer and attachment to outcome creates an uncomfortableness in life. And so then we start seeking solutions to the uncomfortableness in outcomes rather than seeing it's the identity itself. So when we look at who is it that once John is so concerned about what John's doing, we'll find it's this psychological identity. And when we look at what is a psychological identity, it's the output of a biological instrument. There is no entity that is a concrete me doer in the same way as we believe and feel one to be there. And the seeing of this creates the dissolving of that entity, that identity, and a new appreciation of the ability to witness life happen, to witness life unfold, to see movements within ourselves. The speaking is happening. The emotions arise in a body-mind organism. Actions arise through a body-mind organism. And there's the potential for us to witness life happening any time during the day. As soon as our attention lands on the fact that the thinking, whether it's working mind, so functional thinking, working things out, or whether it's the thinking mind, is a happening, is a result of the biological instrument. And something, awareness, the sense of being, can be aware of all that as a happening. So that's about it. We'll take some questions. Who is it? Hello, Zore.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right. Thank you again.
You're very welcome.
I don't know if it echoes back my voice. Is it okay with you?
On my side, it's okay, but you might be able to turn off some volume there. Sometimes you end up with a feedback or something.
Okay. I have a question about pride. I feel like part of it, even though I do know that there is no doer, or I don't take credit for the outcome that I wanted to happen, happens. Mm-hmm. But when I am working hard for a goal in a daily living, mm-hmm. For example, recently I worked very, very hard for a refugee family to get accepted. Mm-hmm. And when I get the news that, yes, they did get accepted, mm-hmm. deep down, I do feel like it is my preference, of course, for this to happen. Mm-hmm. And when it happens, there is a satisfaction feeling inside, which is pride. Mm-hmm. I don't want to, sugarcoat it. It is like I am proud of the hard work. And I do remember, oh my God, I did this, that, and the other mm-hmm. for this to happen. Mm-hmm. I'm not taking credit for it as a doer. yes, I do understand that because of my up-to-date conditioning, and this instrument pushed and pushed, and so the outcome came. Again, it's not like, look at me, I did that, but it is, I feel like it is my preference. It's a biological reaction. Like when you were explaining about anger, I feel like pride is also part of it, is when you're not comparing yourself to anybody else, when you know that any other instrument who was in my position with my genes and my up-to-date conditioning would have gotten the same results, perhaps. But this satisfaction feels like pride, and I don't feel uncomfortable about it. It feels
So
comfortable, and it is not suffering.
Yeah, so just change it to being pleased instead of being proud. Just change the word. I am pleased that this happened.
Right.
I am impressed that this happened.
Okay.
I'm often impressed about things that happen through this body-mind instrument, and pleased with things that happen through this body-mind instrument. I have a tendency to, at the moment, enjoy trying new things. With the internet, we get to watch YouTube, we get to learn how to do things that in the past you would have needed to go to technical colleges to figure out. Now you can spend 5 or 6 days watching YouTube videos and have enough information to go and be a little dangerous and try some things. And as you try some things, you get more experience, and you can become better at something that you've got no formal training in, to the point where you can do some things that you're quite impressed with. Like, wow, I fixed the car, or I built a motor, or I changed some tiles in the bathroom. Things that 10 years ago you might never have thought you could do. And here you are, you approach a problem, and the outcome isn't in your control, right? Sometimes you get a good result and you say, wow, I'm impressed that this is what happened. And then sometimes you get a bad result, and that's where you get to see what your attitude is. So there is very much the potential to be pleased and impressed without taking personal credit for it. Where you see, I'm pleased with what this body-mind organism has produced. And I understand that another time it's bound to make some mistakes and produce some outcomes that are not great.
Yes. Okay. So that was actually my question, that when you try to learn something, then it is, of course, your outcome that you want is to learn it to the maximum of your ability. And when you get there, so if I just change the word, that's fine.
Yeah, that's
okay. Another thing is that when I am listening to you, that's all I want to do, actually. Just listening to video after video after video, and nothing else is like, if my family wants us to watch a movie, yes, I do, but deep down I say, oh God, I wish I could do this. This is what I want to do. And it becomes kind of addictive, I feel like, because I can't get enough, even though I do understand it. And it's just like, it's give me so much pleasure. So when does it stop to just live my normal life without wanting to come back to watching more videos?
Well, a part of it is that there's an intelligence at play that appreciates that there's important information, it's getting important information. So in the same way, if you were learning how to, do a task that you need to do and you don't have the skills, and you watch 3 YouTube videos and you still feel like there are some gaps, you're going to have the urge to watch some more of those instructional videos on that topic to try and get the gaps filled in. And because the talks really, they're saying the same thing, but there's a lot of nuances in the talks, and in some talks some of the things aren't going to be covered, and you might listen to 50 talks, and on the 50th one something that isn't said in all the others gets said, and it fills in one of the pieces of the puzzle. And so if you're listening to the talks and you can appreciate that, you recognize that that's what's happening, and it might not even be on a conscious level. It could be on a sort of subconscious level where the system understands it's getting fed by this information. Then there is going to be a natural draw towards it. And don't worry, there'll be a time where there likely will be this feeling like, oh, enough is enough. And that usually happens when something changes in the system, and then it is time to have a break. The system says, okay, it's time for me to now put this in practice. Not to say that it's not being put in practice while you're absorbing it, but there are these different phases, and the body produces feelings that will direct us in the right way. So, go with it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for dropping in. Hi, Melissa.
Hi, Roger. Hi. Thank you for today. That was really interesting. It's been a while since I've heard you talk about the biological robot. I mean, I'm sure you have, but it's only recently that I've heard you say it again. And I remember hearing it a long time ago and then seeing the program Westworld. I don't know if you've seen it, have you?
I've heard about it. I think I saw an episode.
It's just about these kind of people that realize that they're kind of robots, and it's all about them realizing that in the process, and it's really fascinating. But I guess the point of me talking about that is when I realize that I've spoken to maybe someone out of turn, or the anger arises, and then I reflect on that and see, okay, I could have spoken differently. Like, I couldn't have spoken differently. That was the programming. That's what happened. But then there is this thought that also drops in, like, okay, maybe I can learn how to communicate better. Mm-hmm. And there's this movement towards wanting to make, communication more pleasurable. Mm-hmm. But I see that this is still me looking for, happiness in pleasure. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you could just speak a bit about that, and if that's kind of just like,
well, yeah. So there's no problem with self-improvement if you think that there's something that can be applied, a workshop or a course or whatever. There's no problem with seeing a potential outcome that would be favorable and making moves towards that happening, but understanding exactly what that really means. So one, understanding that whatever workshop or counseling or course that you attend may not deliver the outcome that you hope. And if it does deliver the outcome that you hope, what that is delivering is self-improvement, which means more pleasure. Now, there's nothing wrong with pleasure. In fact, as I said, it makes sense. If you can do something to bring in more pleasure, by all means. The problem is when we identify our sense of self, our happiness, with the pleasure, then we've gone astray. Then we're making a mistake. So the principle in the teaching says, yes, by all means, do your best to even self-improve. Understand that the outcome isn't in your control, and that the outcome is either going to be pleasure or pain, and your happiness isn't going to be found as a result of more pleasure and less pain.
I do feel like there's this constant trying to improve uncomfortable situations, though.
Yes.
Is that normal, like for everyone? Does everyone just do, is that just a natural movement of life?
The body is always going to move towards pleasure and away from pain. That's a biological movement. If there is attachment to pleasure, which is part of the psychological me, then not only is the body going to move towards pleasure and away from pain, but there is going to be an insistence on the psychological level that insists that the pleasure that the body would prefer gets delivered. And so there are two different movements. One is more biological, and there is less of the psychological attachment and insistence on it being delivered, but it will do what it can. That's the biological movement. And the other is a sort of an obsession, a craving on trying to make life perfect, and not being satisfied unless life is perfect. And both of them actually are pretty normal. One of them, meaning the attachment to outcomes, the investment in outcomes, the belief, which when I talk about belief, I don't mean a conscious belief. I mean, when you look at your behavior, and your behavior is obsessed with controlling outcomes, with adjusting things, where all of the attention is, let me make life as perfect as I can. If you see that is what is unfolding, how the body is functioning, then it's a good indication for yourself to go, oh, that the attachment must be in place, because it's translating into, my behavior in life. So it really comes down to a self-discernment about where one stops and where the other kicks in. And the way of discerning is as to whether it feels uncomfortable. Attachment is a form of suffering, and it's always going to reveal itself as uncomfortable in the end. And the biological movement towards pleasure is not uncomfortable, because we say, yes, if I can have that, I'm going to have it. And if I don't get it, I understand that's life.
How do you differentiate between uncomfortableness and suffering and pain in the moment?
How do I differentiate between, say it again?
Uncomfortableness, pain in the moment, and suffering. Or pain in the moment, suffering and uncomfortableness are the same thing, right?
That's right, exactly. So
okay.
Suffering, when we feel into it, is an uncomfortableness with oneself or the other. It's just a general life shouldn't be like this, and it's on a horizontal thinking about what has happened, about what might happen, and generally not feeling in line and in flow with life. Biological pain is when circumstance is not in line with your preferences. And if circumstance is not in line with your preference, the result is pain. And so that simply means, for example, on a physical level, my preference is not to experience physical pain. And so if physical pain is delivered, which really, it's not physical pain, it's, for example, my preference on a physical level is not to experience impact on the body. Now, if impact on the body is delivered, that's not in line with my preference, which is pain. And so it's going to be experienced. And so we can't expect for there to be physical pain and for it to be not discernible as different from physical pleasure, for example. If we can't discern the two, something's going wrong. If you can't discern boiling hot water from nice warm water, there's a problem in the sensory system of the body. One is painful and one isn't. And the same if someone's shouting at you, that's painful on an emotional level, let's say. And I'm not talking about the emotional level where we feel like we are worthless. That's the suffering level. But emotional pain might just say, I don't want to see you upset, and you're upset, and it's not my preference to see you upset. It's not my preference to have someone shout at me in an aggressive way, because aggressiveness is not my preference over friendliness. So if someone is aggressive versus friendly, it's going to deliver, it's painful as opposed to pleasurable. Now, whether it turns into suffering depends on the internal identity that takes it not only as painful but as personal. Because you don't have to take something as personal for it to be painful. But often when something is painful, we then take it personally. And that's when pain gets turned into suffering.
Thank you. That's really helpful, Roger. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks, Melissa. Hi, Brian.
Hey, Roger. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
Okay, I'm good. So my question is a bit nuanced. So let me see if I can actually get this. Maybe I'm not even really sure what it is, but it seems to go around like there's a hierarchy of decisions, or that's what I seem to be believing, in a certain sense. Like I have to make the right decision. So I guess in the end, decisions are just happening. So I don't necessarily have any control over what the outcome is or what decision is made, or, that just goes as it goes. But there seems to be a flow that you can fall into where decisions feel lighter or more in line with understanding. And as a result, there's more, and not to make it too like grandiose or anything, but like there's more love in them, or there's more understanding that comes as a result of making a decision. For example, I went to a retreat. I just got back from a retreat with Lisa Cairns. I think she was one of your students. And if I wouldn't have made that decision, for example, then there might have been a different outcome that would not have been as in line with understanding or love or whatever. So I see myself a little bit struggling with that and trying to hold on to different decisions. So there must be some kind of like misunderstanding, or something hasn't sunk in fully, because then I blame myself if I make the wrong decisions one after the other, or it doesn't seem to be in line with with a deeper guidance, or in line with the heart, really. Is I think what ultimately seems important.
Yeah, when it comes to decisions, I think what we need to, in a way, let go of is the outcome, and it's about seeing the process more clearly. So, you according to your makeup, according to your design, might be calculated in the way you make decisions. I'm calculated in the way I make decisions. So that means I try and get as much information. I try to allow it to sink in the system, weigh this up, weigh that up. And at the end, I tend to find, that's the product that I'm looking for, or that's the where I want to spend the day. And even though it's calculated, in the end, it's just a final click because of a whole lot of factors, information about, objective information, but then there'll be some other intuitions, let's say, might play into it. And it's a mix of a whole lot of things, and we don't really know what that process is. It's a very complex process, and each of us are going to have our own way of processing. So I know my way is calculated, but that for someone else, they might say, "Oh, I never make calculated decisions. I just, close my eyes and pick and trust that that's what I was meant to pick." And if the person is comfortable with that, it's a very valid way of living life, because when we look at it, we see, life has designed that person according to their genes and up-to-date conditioning to make decisions by closing their eyes and picking. And that's life unfolding, and the outcome is going to be whatever the outcome is going to be. It's actually not about outcomes being perfect, but rather one being in flow with the making of the decisions. If you make decisions because of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, and they consistently give results that are not good, then that becomes new conditioning. The fact that the result is not ideal is new conditioning. And for someone who learns quickly, that will change the up-to-date conditioning, and the decision-making process will change. And maybe we'll find better outcomes. But still, we're never in control of outcomes, because we're always making decisions based on our makeup. And we've either got a makeup that makes decisions that gives good outcomes or not. And even if we have a system that makes calculated or non-calculated decisions, but they deliver generally good outcomes, there's always going to be the time when something isn't processed, or something out of left field happens, and the outcome's not going to be good. So the attitude towards decision making, to me, is an attitude. Yes, the body-mind organism is always going to be faced with a circumstance with several options that are available, and it's going to pick one of the many options, and one of the options is to do nothing, to be indecisive, and that's destiny unfolding. So there are options, and there's a mechanism that we can call choosing or decision making, but it doesn't mean that there is a me doer making a choice. There is a biological instrument finding itself in a situation with options available, and at a certain point, the biological instrument makes or picks one of those options, which is what we can call making a choice, but it doesn't imply a chooser as a doer. It just implies a choosing mechanism. And so that means that there can be a relaxation with making a decision, because we see, well, it's going to happen according to my design. And if we know that the outcome is at best pleasure and at worst pain, neither of which are what my happiness is dependent on. So if I make a decision and the outcome is bad, at least I know that my attitude when the outcome is not great, I go, well, that's painful. That's pain in the moment. It could be financial pain. It can be physical pain. It could be emotional pain. It could be missing out on an experience. And at the same time, the attitude says, yeah, but that's life, and my peace exists in being able to surrender into the fact that in this moment it's painful, because the decision was the wrong decision relative to pain, to pleasure, for example. And then decisions become less important.
It's like, you can make decisions that move you closer to truth and happiness, but essentially what you're saying, and much of your message, if I'm getting it right, is like they're not to be found in any outcomes, truth or happiness, or so. But at the same time, you can make a decision that like moves you closer to the heart, or moves you seemingly closer to truth and happiness, or to understanding of it, or it's sinking in more deeply.
Mm-hmm. But
maybe that's
who's making the
maybe
decision?
that's also delusion.
who's making the decision that moves you closer to happiness?
Yeah, it doesn't seem like there's a clear... Okay, there's no like entity, there's only thought about it.
Yeah. So the decision is a happening. So if we see that there are decisions that bring us closer, then we say, oh, that's a happening that brought me closer. And if there's a decision that takes you further away, you go, that's a happening that took me further away. So if we start saying, oh, but I can, the doer, yesterday I made a decision that took me closer. Why am I not making a decision today that takes me closer as well? And the reason that happens is because we failed to see yesterday a decision happened through a body-mind organism. It was a happening, and it just so happened that the outcome was moving me closer to or more in line with flow of life. And then today a decision happens, and it doesn't do that. It is a movement. Let's say we've got an attitude towards things that feels disconnected, and so we say, why am I functioning in this disconnected, out of flow, attached to outcomes way, whereas yesterday I was doing it so well? And I'm not doing it. Yesterday it was happening. Today it's happening. Yesterday it was different from today.
The peace is found.
The peace.
Did you hear me, or?
I just heard the end of it. The peace is found.
That's where the peace is found, in knowing that either decision is happening and it wasn't my responsibility. There's no...
There's no
one.
More accurately, I would say that the lack of peace is found in the attitude that says, hey, why was I able to do it yesterday and I can't do it today? That's where the lack of peace is found. That's where the suffering comes up, in that, hey, why am I not able to do it the same way as I did yesterday? Why is the outcome not the same? That's where the suffering is. So in this other attitude that says that's just how it's happening. Yesterday things were flow and today they're not. And in that attitude there is the absence of suffering, which is peace.
Comparison, like yesterday it was this way and today it's this way and it should be different, has to assume that there's someone that could adjust it, or that it has been done wrong, so that there's a doer.
Exactly. Instead of seeing there is a mechanism that, because this is the thing we see, but I apply myself to being more loving, let's say. And I was making headway, we could say. I really was making headway. And then, so when that happens, so we want to be more loving, we apply ourselves to being more loving, and then we're more loving. And so it reinforces, oh yes, I am the doer. Whereas really what is happening is a thought arises that says, the way I am is causing pain for someone else. So let me try and be different. Let me try and act differently, is the thought. And then in subsequent days, we find ourselves acting differently, and we see the other person being much less pained by our actions. And so we say, oh, good, I had this intention, I applied myself, and I got this result. Which is really not what's happening. What's happening is a thought arose, a set of actions happened that just happened to bring about a change in our behavior, and then a consequence happened. And so another time, we'll have a thought. The actions that are required for that intention don't happen and the outcome doesn't happen, because we've looked at the original where things turned out the way we say, oh, I am in control. I remember back, in January, I made this happen. And so that's only because in the way we see what happened in January is being seen with the wrong attitude. So then we go into the present moment saying, I'm the doer. I remember in January I did it. And so now I should be able to do it again. So we really do need to reframe how we see everything that has happened as a happening according to the instrument. So the instrument is very much designed to be functional often. And so let's not mistake the fact that the instrument is designed to be functional as there being a me doer.
It sounds like you're frozen. Can you still hear me?
Oh, I can hear you, yes.
Oh, you froze up for, okay. So this sounds kind of like the animal brain. It performs a certain action and then gets a reward from that action and then expects if I execute the same action again, I will receive the same reward. But yeah, if it doesn't, then it's the blame, shame, guilt, whatever that,
Yes,
that's the doer. Yeah.
that's it.
It does seem like on the relative level, it kind of seems like when you talk about like making decisions that doing exactly what you feel like, you can make a decision. Well, you can make decisions that sort of like where what you feel like is sort of covered up. And you just make decisions that are automatically, in line with your conditioning, but that don't feel right or don't feel in alignment or heart-centered, is what I would say for me.
Yeah, so you make decisions from a list of shoulds and shouldn'ts rather than, so what you feel like is, so it's rather more what you think you should and shouldn't do in that moment.
And then, so do you have any way for coming or reconditioning, a way of reconditioning to coming back to making decisions that are in alignment with what you actually truly feel like? That.
Well, I say that tends to change when we become aware of the difference or the potential for doing it differently. So if we realize, oh, I do make decisions from shoulds and shouldn'ts in such a way that it cuts off access to appreciating what I feel like on a on a physical, on a biological level, because I just say, oh well, my friend needs my help, so I should help them, and that should overrides maybe a set of instructions that are saying something different. And if we're conditioned to, this is what I have to do in this situation, then, as you say, we're cut off from feeling and maybe getting a different instruction. So once we hear that is very much a way that decisions are made, and it's very linked to attachment to outcomes, and it's very much linked to doing what you should do, which is often what your parents have told you is important, and we don't question it. So once we hear that, and then we start becoming aware of our decision-making process, and if we see, hey, this is how I make decisions, and it's described as being part of the dynamic of the psychological doer that is attached to outcomes, we may find a different movement happening, where instead of saying yes to something we've always said yes to, realizing now that it's from a I should say yes, we might realize, hey, I can say no. I've never thought it's valid to actually listen to what my body is saying And my body says, no, it's not appropriate for me to do what ordinarily I would say yes to. And so we try making a decision from a different place and seeing the outcome. And what I suggest is that as we shift from doing what we should and shouldn't do to what our body is telling us, where many more inputs get assessed rather than just a sort of should and shouldn't that says, I am the general and this is what we're going to do. As we start opening up to a whole lot of different inputs, we feel a great relief. We feel, wow, why didn't someone tell me I can live life differently a long time ago? And the more that we realize that that way of thinking is taking me out of alignment, out of a flow, into a cumulative sense of uncomfortableness, which is what happens as we make more and more decisions from shoulds and out of fear and out of attachment. As we start realizing that, then automatically there's a shift to a different set of instructions. And I've often said in the past that I see that the biological feelings that we overlook because we are so conditioned to do things a certain way, we're told this is the only way that is valid. As we realize there's a different set of instructions, I say that's my instruction from God to do what I feel like in each moment. It's also the instruction from God to do what you think you should or shouldn't do. However, what I found in my experience is I had access to two sets of instructions from God. One that allowed me to feel a sense of relief and in flow, and the other that cumulatively made me feel more and more uncomfortable in life. So whichever one you pick, it's your instruction from God. Neither of them are you functioning incorrectly in the bigger sense of things. But you might realize one creates an uncomfortableness, the other creates a flow and an ease and a comfortableness and a relief. So I decided to go with the instruction from God that delivered the ease, flow, and relief.
So initially that might look really radical, right? Going from shoulds and shouldn'ts, if that's how you've lived your life for a long time, to doing exactly what the biological system feels like. I can see people around me, especially family, for example, being like, that's, this is not great. Like, you need to figure these things out. You need to, if you say, for example, I'm not going to look for a job, but I'm out of money, and I'm going to follow the flow of the moment because that feels more heartfelt or more in line with the biological flow. It seems hard. Well, I think this is the mind. I think this is just mental, really. But it seems tough on a societal level and on from the structures around you or people around you. Yeah. Well, I guess that just happens. You know?
Yeah, and it's often their attachment and maybe your attachment to their approval that makes it scary and challenging. And I guess there's things that we need to realize. So if you see that, their way of living life, the way they say should be how you live life, isn't delivering great results for them in terms of their own happiness, then you might say, hey, why am I listening to them if they're not that happy? Why am I assuming that what they're saying is how you should live life is actually right, when in fact the result is not that great? So it's little insights like that that give us the potential to do something different, even in the face of ridicule of the other, when we might realize that your ridicule is not that logical. What you're doing is telling me to live the way you live, and I don't see that that's necessarily that great. It may also be that, you know, you have some money saved up, and something inside of you normally would say, you know, you've got to keep that money saved up, you've got to go and get a great job, and so you can maintain your existing standard of living, live, you know, hang out in the same circle of friends, live in the same neighborhood and whatever. And if all those things are prioritized as very important, then I should go back, I should get a good paying job, and becomes the road we're automatically directed down when those things are our priorities. But at a certain time, we might get this sense that says, you know, that lifestyle I've set up, I just don't feel like it's the answer. And so then we might look at, I don't know, $5,000 that you have in the bank that ordinarily is, one, not going to get you very far in your ordinary lifestyle, and two, you always want to have it as a backup or something like that. And at a different point in time, we might say, actually, if I reduce my expenses, if I make life much more simple, if I change my living accommodation, then I might be able to look at the whole thing differently. And we might find that not working for a while is not as crazy as someone else might think, because we can say, well, actually, I've got 3 months potential here to take a break if I change some things around. So it really does require an internal change of priorities, and we're not really in control of that. But we, you know, there's many people that have the experience that at a certain point in time, this urge to do things differently comes up, and that's basically us being lived in that new way.
And just to allow that, honor that, and there's really nobody to really I think the most powerful pointer here is really who, every time, and coming back to that. So yeah. Thank you, Roger. But I think Frank G is unmuted, by the way. He's kind of in the background. I can hear him.
Oh, right, okay.
Or I hear something. There we go. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Roger. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for dropping in.
Yeah.
Hello, Peter.
Hey, how are you, Roger?
Very good. And you?
Do you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Oh, I'm good. Thank you. Yeah, very good. Yes, pleasure to be able to ask questions like this. I had a thought. I was thinking about this whole notion of doership, non-doership, and I guess this question probably betrays the fact that I have not fully integrated the idea of non-doership, but it does cross my mind, and it came up. Question comes up. I'm a musician, and well, among other things. But I noticed the process of playing music, for example, improvisational music. Often I'll catch myself while playing music, and I guess this applies to other aspects in life, but I guess the musical improvisational process sort of highlights this thought, which is, I'll be playing something and I'll think. Essentially, in the terms of this teaching, it comes down to an attachment to outcomes, because I'll be playing something and then I'll have the thought, oh, this doesn't sound good. Or this sounds good. They're sort of flip sides of the same thought, I think. And as soon as I have that thought, that essentially an attachment to outcome, then everything kind of goes south. You're sort of distracted from the moment. It essentially it takes you out of that moment. That attachment to outcome. I guess attachment to outcomes are essentially with taking you out of the sort of present moment. But I had the thought that, and this is maybe paradoxical to the whole teaching, that does this, and I guess it could also be a trap, perhaps, but the idea that, and I noticed if I'm not attached to outcomes, then sort of the result is better. Like paradoxically, the outcome is improved. I mean, maybe that doesn't apply in all cases, but in that sort of, if I'm not attached to the outcome of making music, then it ends up ultimately sounding better. So it gave me the thought that is there, and I've never really heard you talk about, but is there an actual, and again, this shows that I am attached to outcomes, but is there a sort of benefit in terms of circumstances to adopting this attitude? And it seems to me that there could be, just in terms of, external circumstances of having that attitude of non-doership, essentially.
Well, I think that...
You understand?
I think what happens is when the attitude of non-doership is in play, which really means when the attitude of doership has fallen away, we find that the biological entity is able to function much more efficiently, function much more intelligently than when the attachment and doership is at play. Basically, attachment and doership is ignorance, and so it doesn't add value. So being attached to an outcome doesn't make an outcome happen. Being attached to an outcome interferes with the efficiency and the intelligence of the biological instrument. So artists know this firsthand, that once they get into the flow and the me that is claiming ownership falls away, they really feel like the art, the creativity is flowing through them as an instrument. So I'm sure you've got that experience, had that experience as a musician, when you just let things happen based on your, the body's skill set, because it's practiced and all of that, and you just let go of the outcome and you let the intelligence function. It produces much better outcomes. It functions much more efficiently. So Ramesh used to talk about, two great surgeons, and suddenly they find themselves operating on the prime minister, and let's say they're in a regime where, if you're the surgeon and the prime minister dies, you're in a lot of trouble. And so if the surgeons are there and they're thinking about, if this goes wrong, I'm in a lot of trouble, that functioning is not helpful to the success of the operation. It's actually likely to create more problems. So if there are, even if there's a surgeon with much better skills, if the thinking mind comes in, it's going to interfere with the operation of those better skills, and a less skilled surgeon with no thinking mind in the same moment might produce better results. So we see that the thinking mind actually comes in and interferes with an efficiency. And we've heard, Nijinsky, the famous dancer, said Nijinsky dances best when Nijinsky's not there. And I think that sums it up. That makes perfect sense, and I've experienced that. Not to belabor this, because I think that, but
I actually listened to, the reason I'm asking this question, because I listened to, I sort of assumed that to be the case always. I mean, I've often sort of been aware of that interference. But I heard you, and not to hold you to this, but I heard you, I listened to one of your YouTube satsangs recently. I don't know when it was. I think it was some time ago, and you said that you posited the theory that a sort of early man, caveman, for example, you posited the theory that this development of an attitude of non-doership is sort of an evolutionary, perhaps, process, which we've witnessed in other enlightened beings, and perhaps early cavemen, for example, when they were hunting saber-toothed tigers, this particular evolutionary adaptation of non-doership was not helpful to them, and that in fact and perhaps I'm expressing this wrong, that this is not what you meant, but my understanding was you were suggesting that an attitude of doership was actually beneficial in the context of environment of, let's say, early, prehistoric, or not, prehistoric man, hunting a saber tooth, for example. So that it sort of flew in the face of this idea that, non-doership ultimately is a beneficial adaptation, whether you're hunting a saber-toothed tiger or whether you're trying to decide, whether you should take a certain job, like in a more modern context. I don't know if I'm being clear, but it sort of contradicts the notion, because ultimately an attitude of non-doership would seem to be ultimately beneficial to the to the human being. Again, I don't want to hold you to that. I was just wondering if maybe
it's a nuanced
something in there.
That point is a nuanced point, because in theory the attitude of non-doership, as you said, doesn't affect you successfully partaking in something. Like it won't affect you defending yourself from a saber-toothed tiger, because the attitude of non-doership isn't going to get in the way of your biological intelligence, your biological preference. Why I've made that point in the past is because we see, in a way, an evolution, a development where now happiness, rather than just surviving, so surviving happily is starting to become more of the focus. And the only reason why surviving happily is becoming more of the focus is because more of the surviving part has been taken care of. So Ramesh used to say, this teaching isn't for someone below the poverty line. Now, when we look at it, it is on one level for everyone, because anyone who has the attitude of non-doership, even if they're below the poverty line, will do whatever they are doing during the day to survive with the attitude of non-doership. What he meant, though, is if someone is so busy surviving, and if you were to talk to them about happiness in daily living, they'll say, listen, to be honest, I put all of my effort in providing for my family and making sure that we have shelter over our heads and food in our stomach. And I'm below the poverty line, which means many days my efforts don't even get us to that level. So he said, with due respect, can we talk about happiness at some other point when I have more time to talk about it? And so if we think about this, we realize, right, so for someone who still hasn't reached the level where they have that level of safety, then happiness is sort of doesn't make it into the list of priorities yet. Once life has got us to a point where we can survive, then we start being interested in surviving happily. And so essentially back with in the prehistoric times, they were more focused on just surviving. And so it's not so much that they had the attitude of doership because it was beneficial, but rather because they hadn't put the time into investigating whether that was valid or not. So really, I was just mentioning that as an explanation that makes sense relative to the fact that as life develops, we are now seeming to move closer to a happy life rather than just a life survived. And so I think that in 1,000 years, if humanity survives and evolution continues, then relative to humanity today, humanity then will be more advanced in a sense. I think happiness will be a standard thing. So in the future, if we continue in a certain trajectory, I think people will find that they have to work much less hard. One, to survive. There'll be a lot of automation, free energy, robots making things and fixing things and fixing the robots, and humans will possibly be freed up to do much more of what they enjoy, and they'll probably also feel a causeless sense of contentment. That this is optimistic, but it also makes sense based on this notion of development and evolution tends to deal with what is most pressing. And so if survival is still important, then evolution is going to focus on that, and then it will move to the next priority once the other priorities have been dealt with.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. But I just, in theory, though, let's say the one who's defending himself, the prehistoric man defending himself from the saber-toothed tiger, if through some fluke he were to, be exposed to a teaching or, and he were to have an attitude of non-doership, it would, or let's say a modern man who's below the poverty line and living on the street, if you could assimilate this attitude of non-doership, it would alleviate your suffering. I mean, it would still serve the same function regardless of your sort of state of poverty. No?
Yes, it shouldn't get in the way of you feeding yourself to the best of your ability, which means you may not be able to feed yourself, but you wouldn't. It means you wouldn't be able to feed yourself even with the attitude of doership. So it's more a function of they didn't have it, not because it was beneficial to them, but rather they just hadn't got round to looking at it. And frankly, humanity today hasn't really got round to looking at it either.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, true. All right. Well, thank you very much. It's very interesting.
You're very welcome. What's the time? I think. Okay, we'll take one more question. Hello, Andrea.
Hey, Roger.
Hello.
Thank you for as usual.
You're welcome.
So I had just two questions. One was if you're eager for a result or excited for something in the future, how is that different from expectation, or is it expectation? And then the other question was, you mentioned in one of your satsangs about abolishment, and how when the system's not ready for it, it's not a good thing to protest, I guess. But I don't know, it just seems that protest a lot or abolish a lot, it just pushes the system into changing eventually. I don't know, just a bit confused with those two.
What was the word you used along with protesting? Abolishment. But abolishment of what? Certain practices, you mean? Like certain social standards?
Like protesting against social injustices, or like, I understand that the priority is peace of mind, and if it comes from that place, if you're not suffering from it, there's no attachment to outcomes. But if you're not constantly protesting for human rights or whatever, eventually the system will change, or it wouldn't get the system ready to change for a cause.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting topic because, like, if we look at it, the most protesters are protesting with an attitude of attachment to outcome, and if that's the case, it's the attitude of attachment that is their uncomfortableness. And so they're protesting and they're uncomfortable while protesting. You could have, and that attachment to outcome is there, is just, we could say, the default human condition. You could have an activist or a protester that is protesting without an attachment to outcome. And so they're saying, yes, if you ask me whether I think this action could be improved, yes, I think it can. Or this social standard, can it be improved? Yes, I think it can. Do I think it's important that it be improved? Yes, I think it's important. So I'm going to stand up with the group. However, I'm very clear on the fact that this protester that is not attached to outcomes, that it doesn't matter how much I think this is going to be better. It doesn't matter how important I think it is. It may not happen because there could be greater forces at play. Now, that activist that understands that says, but if I do turn up and protest, the force of the protest may be greater than the force preventing the change, and therefore the change will happen. So I'm going to stand up for what I believe in, but understand the outcome's not in my control. And that then means that when it's time to turn up at a rally, they switch into activism mode. And after the rally, you can forget about it and see what the result is. And in between, you can forget about it. And someone might say, no, if I forget about it, then I'm not putting continuous pressure. So I say, well, think about it as much as is practically beneficial for putting the required pressure out there. But very often, our attachment turns into a thinking about it where there is a resentment to the other party at times when we could be enjoying life instead of feeling resentful. Having said that, if we there's been plenty of change in history that is beneficial because of suffering protesters, because of protesters that were attached to outcomes, which being attached to the outcome isn't what makes the protest successful. Being attached to the outcome just makes the protester unhappy, because you can turn up and make your point when you're not attached to the outcome. In fact, it's those protesters that are attached to outcomes that tend to get in the way of things becoming smooth, because they'll be violent, they'll be, and that's not what brings about the change. Or maybe it is. And so if it is what brings about the change, then we have to be grateful for those dynamics being at play. So, I definitely wouldn't say that I would wish that people stop fighting for what they believe is good, because very definitely that brings about positive change. What is most important in the context of these talks is to realize that if I'm an activist and a protester with an attachment to outcome, which is simply an unhealthy outlook on life, I'm going to be an unhappy protester. And I can stand up for what I believe is an improvement without being attached to the outcome.
Thank you.
And what was the first thing that you mentioned?
First question was if you're eager for a result or excited for something in the future, how is that different from expectation, or is it expectation if you are looking forward?
It will be if the psychological identity of doership and attachment is there, then automatically, as soon as we get introduced into the system, some potential, holiday or something that appeals to us, then the doer, the psychological identity, will say, okay, this is how life is going to turn out in the future. I'm invested in that. I'm looking forward to it. And if it were to change, if it wasn't to unfold that way, then the identity that has invested itself in that outcome is going to feel very flattened and very attacked by the fact that life hasn't turned out that way. So that's attachment, where we feel defined in a sense, or we feel invested psychologically, and a sense of self invested in that happening. On the other hand, if your preference is to see someone that you haven't seen for a long time, and they say, oh, I'm coming to visit in 2 months' time, then naturally there can be an excitement, and it's like, oh, that's great, I'm so excited to see you. And then a month before, you speak to them and you say, oh, I'm really looking forward to seeing you. Now, if attachment to outcome is the identity, then it's almost guaranteed that I'm really looking forward to see you will be infused with, I need to see you, this needs to happen, I'm invested in it. If, however, the attachment to outcome isn't our identity, then we can say, yes, that's going to probably be pleasurable. I remember spending time with this person and we had a great time in the past. And so there's an excitement. But that excitement, that pleasure, is tempered, is infused with the understanding that, hey, this outcome hasn't happened yet, and let's expect the unexpected, which basically means I understand that my friend may cancel 5 minutes before they are due to arrive. That's life. And so if we've excluded that as a possibility, if we've pretended it cannot happen, then as soon as it happens, there's going to be this big gap in our, a gap between how life is unfolding and our expectation of how life unfolds. So the bigger the gap between our expectation and the more solid our expectation is, then the bigger the uncomfortableness, until the two eventually align. So I used to say that I write plans in 4H pencil, which really means when someone says they're coming, I write it write it in pencil, which really means I understand it can get rubbed out very quickly. Because that's life, if we have an idea of what might happen in the future, it may, but it may not.
I've been using a pencil for a couple of months now, so thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.